Educational disclaimer. This documentary explores Operation Overlord, D-Day, and the Normandy campaign for educational purposes only. All material is sourced from publicly available historical resources and academic sources. This content does not glorify war or promote any ideology. Rather, it analyzes the strategic decisions, leadership challenges, and human consequences of this pivotal World War II operation. Educational objectives. To examine how strategic planning and deception shaped the outcome of Operation Overlord. To analyze how leadership decisions under pressure influenced battlefield results. To understand the geographical and logistical challenges that determine success and failure. To explore the human dimension of war through multiple perspectives. The Contingency Letter. On the night of June 5, 1944, as the greatest armada in history crossed the English Channel, General Eisenhower wrote a note he hoped would never be read. "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone," he wrote. What did he know that made him prepare for failure? Why was the largest amphibious invasion in history considered such a gamble? Today, we'll reveal how close D-Day came to disaster. Surprising fact. The popular image of D-Day as a glorious victory march obscures its precarious nature. In reality, the operation's success hung by a thread, dependent on factors as unpredictable as weather patterns and as fragile as human courage. D-Day's success was never guaranteed. Consider these surprising realities that challenge the conventional narrative. Of the 5 targeted beaches, Omaha came so close to catastrophic failure that commanders briefly considered evacuation. Weather delays nearly derailed the entire operation, with only a 48-hour window eventually becoming available. The deception operation convincing Hitler that Calais was the real target may have been more decisive than any weapon deployed. What transformed this enormous gamble into history's most consequential amphibious landing? The answer lies in understanding the strategic decisions made by commanders on both sides and how geography, leadership psychology, and adaptability determined the outcome of history's largest amphibious invasion. Today, we'll examine the strategic decisions that changed the course of World War II, the decisions that made under extreme pressure, with incomplete information, and with the fate of millions hanging in the balance. What would you have done in Eisenhower's position? Strategic overview, the geographic chessboard. The geographic challenge facing Allied planners represented a strategic puzzle of unprecedented scale. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's ambitious defensive network stretching nearly 4,000 miles from Norway to Spain, required 13 million tons of concrete and thousands of gun emplacements. By 1944, with Soviet forces advancing from the east, opening a Western front became imperative. But where to strike? This decision would determine the fate of the entire operation. The obvious choice, the Pas-de-Calais region, offered the shortest crossing from England, just 25 miles across the Channel. German commanders, particularly Hitler himself, considered this the logical landing site. However, this very logic made it the most heavily defended section of coastline in Europe. While geographical factors determining the strategy. 1. Beach characteristics, gradients, obstacles, exits to inland areas. 2. Distance to strategic objectives, major ports, road networks, cities. 3. Terrain beyond beaches. The Norman hedgerow country would later prove challenging. 4. Tidal patterns, dictating precise timing of landings. 5. Weather conditions, determining visibility for air support and sea conditions. Battlefield mystery. Why did Allied planners ultimately choose Normandy over the more obvious Calais region? This critical decision, which we'll explore later, hinged on 3 key factors: surprise, defensibility of landing zones, and the strategic position for subsequent operations. The Allies developed revolutionary solutions to overcome geographical limitations. particularly the Mulberry Harbors, massive artificial ports towed across the channel that would prove essential for sustaining the beachhead. Without capturing a major port immediately, these floating harbors would be the invasion's logistical lifeline. What if had the Allies chosen Calais? As the Germans expected, the heavily concentrated defenses might have turned D-Day into a modern Gallipoli, a disastrous amphibious failure. Instead, the Normandy choice created a strategic surprise that gave the operation its first critical advantage. Geography dictated another crucial element: the timing. The invasion required a specific combination of factors. 1. Full moon for visibility during airborne operations. 2. Low tide at dawn to reveal beach obstacles. 3. Calm seas for landing craft. 4. Clear skies for air support. These requirements left only a few potential dates in June 1944. When storms forced Eisenhower to delay by 24 hours on June 5th, he faced enormous pressure. Further postponement would mean waiting weeks for the next suitable tide conditions, potentially compromising the entire operation's secrecy. Leadership analysis. The invasion pitted contrasting leadership philosophies against each other, with each commander's personalities directly shaping battlefield outcomes. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. Leadership strength. Coalition building and maintaining Allied unity among competing national interests and strong personalities. Personal approach. You must be their leader, their father and mentor. Eisenhower believed in leadership through relationship building and consensus rather than rigid authority. On June 4th, faced with contradictory weather forecasts, Eisenhower made what may be history's most consequential meteorological decision. With thousands of vessels already at sea and hundreds of thousands of men in position, he delayed the operation by 24 hours, balancing the enormous risks of either losing the element of surprise or launching in dangerous conditions. Eisenhower's reputation has evolved significantly over decades. Once criticized by some historians as merely a diplomatic chairman of the board rather than a strategic mastermind, recent scholarship acknowledges his crucial ability to manage competing egos and national interests while making decisive calls under extreme pressure. Bernard Montgomery, Allied Ground Forces Commander. Leadership strength, meticulous planning, and building overwhelming force before committing to action. Personal approach, self-assured to the point of arrogance. Montgomery prioritized British interests and his own reputation, sometimes at the expense of coalition harmony. His strategic philosophy are: the morale of the soldier is the greatest single factor in war. Montgomery's caution stemmed partly from Britain's earlier losses and dwindling manpower reserves. Montgomery's leadership failure failed to capture Cannon D-Day as planned, significantly delaying the overall campaign timeline. His tendency to claim success regardless of actual outcomes created tension with American commanders. British troops viewed Montgomery as a leader who wouldn't waste their lives, while Americans often saw him as excessively cautious. These contrasting perceptions reflected national experiences. Britain had been at war since 1939 and could not sustain heavy casualties, while America brought fresh forces and different expectations. This makes multiple perspective on the both side. Omar Bradley, U.S. First Army Commander. Leadership strength, tactical flexibility and ability to adapt plans to battlefield realities. Personal approach, known as the soldier's general, Bradley maintained calm under pressure and focused on practical problem-solving rather than personal glory. Bradley's strategic innovation. When faced with the unexpected challenges of Normandy's hedgerow country, Bradley developed specialized equipment and tactics rather than persisting with failing approaches. Bradley's greatest insight came in planning Operation COBRA, recognizing that concentrated force in a narrow sector could achieve breakthrough, where broader advances had stalled. The balance of his leadership, concerned with casualties but willing to accept necessary losses for strategic objectives. A middle path between Montgomery's extreme caution and Patton's aggressive style. Erwin Rommel, German Field Marshal. Leadership strength, defensive innovation, and accurate prediction of Allied tactics. Rommel represents a complex figure in military history. He was respected by his enemies for tactical brilliance, while serving a genocidal regime. His later involvement in the plot against Hitler adds another layer to historical assessment. Strategic insight correctly predicted that Allied air superiority would prevent German reinforcement after landings. His insistence on positioning armor directly at invasion beaches would have been devastating had it been implemented. Erwin Rommel leadership constraint. Divided command structure with von Rundstedt undermined Rommel's defensive preparations. Hitler's insistence on maintaining personal control of armored reserves proved catastrophic. By D-Day, Rommel had grown disillusioned with Hitler's leadership. His eventual involvement in the July 20th plot against Hitler would lead to his forced suicide. The crucial leadership decision. Eisenhower's weather call. Decision point analysis. With thousands of vessels already at sea and initial airborne operations scheduled, Eisenhower faced contradictory weather forecasts on June 4th. The options were stark. Proceed with the invasion despite dangerous conditions. Delay by 24 hours with risk of losing secrecy. Or postpone for weeks until the next suitable tide window. Eisenhower later described this as the most difficult decision of his career. What made it particularly challenging was the impossibility of knowing with certainty which choice was correct. Behind the decision, Chief Meteorologist Group, Captain Stagg identified a narrow 36-hour window of improved conditions. Eisenhower's decision to trust this forecast, against the opinion of other weather experts, represented the high-stakes gambling aspect of strategic leadership. The what-if analysis. Had Eisenhower delayed until late June, German defenses would have been significantly strengthened, and the artificial harbors might have faced even worse weather. The 24-hour delay was itself consequential. German commanders, seeing poor weather conditions, had stood down coastal alerts, and some key officers were away from their posts. Critical turning points. The decisive moments. Turning point number 1, the deception campaign. Conventional wisdom challenged. While military histories often focus on battlefield heroics, the most decisive Allied weapon may have been an elaborate fiction. Operation Fortitude, the comprehensive deception campaign suggesting a Calais landing, succeeded so completely that even after D-Day began, Hitler kept vital armored divisions near Calais waiting for the real invasion. Technological advantage. The Allies deployed a sophisticated arsenal of deception. Inflatable tanks and aircraft creating phantom armies. Double agents feeding false intelligence. Fake radio traffic simulating large force movements. Dummy paratroopers dropped away from actual landing zones. Strategic analysis. The deception campaign succeeded because it told Hitler what he already believed, that Calais was the logical invasion site. This demonstrates how preconceptions can be exploited more effectively than attempting to create entirely new beliefs. Battlefield mystery resolved. Allied intelligence had intercepted German defensive plans, revealing the heavier concentration of forces at Calais. The choice of Normandy was partly based on knowing where the enemy wasn't, a classic application of Sun Tzu's principle of attacking where the enemy is weak. Chain of decisions. The success at Normandy stemmed directly from Hitler's decision to keep the 15th Army positioned near Calais for weeks after June 6th. This single decision, influenced by Allied deception, may have been more consequential than any tactical choice made on the beaches themselves. The what-if analysis. Had German high command not been fooled by Operation Fortitude, Rommel's preferred strategy of positioning armor directly at the invasion beaches might have made the landings catastrophically costly or even impossible. If panzer divisions immediately available at the beaches, Allied forces might have been pushed back into the sea. Turning point number 2, Omaha Beach crisis. Battlefield perspective. Of the 5 landing beaches, only Omaha faced near catastrophic failure. By mid-morning on June 6th, the situation was so dire that commanders considered evacuating the beachhead. What transformed Omaha into Bloody Omaha was a series of compounding disasters. Naval bombardment fell too far inland, leaving German defenses intact. Amphibious DD tanks sank in rough seas. 27 of 29 tanks were lost. Strong currents pushed landing craft off target. The terrain forced a bottleneck at beach exits. Tactical reality. By 8:30 hours, barely half the first wave remained effective fighting forces. Bodies and disabled equipment littered the shoreline, and surviving troops were pinned down by fire from intact German positions. The crisis point came when commanders considered evacuation. Colonel George Taylor's famous order: "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here," exemplified the decisive leadership that prevented retreat. Chain of decisions. The eventual breakthrough at Omaha resulted not from the original battle plan, but from individual initiative by junior officers and soldiers who found paths up the bluffs. This demonstrated how battlefield adaptation at the lowest levels can overcome strategic planning failures. The experience at Omaha Beach raises important questions about the human cost of strategic decisions. The high casualty rate, over 2,000 Americans, prompts reflection on whether sufficient naval and air bombardment was allocated to this sector. Unseen factors. The defending German 352nd Infantry Division had recently reinforced the sector. Intelligence the Allies had but failed to fully incorporate into planning. This oversight led to significantly stronger opposition than anticipated. Turning point number 3, the artificial harbors. While dramatic beach assaults capture popular imagination, the engineering marvel of the Mulberry Harbors arise. Mulberry Harbors is a massive artificial port that towed across the channel. It solved the critical supply problem that could have doomed the entire operation. Logistics reality. Military success depends on supply chains. Without capturing a deep water port immediately, the invasion faced a fundamental challenge: how to land the thousands of vehicles, tons of supplies, and reinforcements needed daily. Behind the engineering of Mulberry Harbor, the Mulberry Harbors represented one of history's greatest feats of military engineering. Concrete caissons the size of 5-story buildings, floating roadways that rose and fell with tides, breakwaters created from scuttled ships and floating structures, capacity to process 7,000 vehicles and 15,000 tons of supplies daily. The what-if strategic. When a massive storm destroyed the American Mulberry on June 19th to 22nd, it created a logistics crisis that nearly halted the advance. Had both harbors been lost, the entire beachhead might have become unsustainable. Conventional wisdom challenged. The Mulberry Harbors demonstrate how logistical innovation often proves more decisive than weaponry. While tanks and planes dominate military histories, this engineering solution literally created the foundation for Allied victory. Chain of decisions. Churchill had championed the harbor concept despite skepticism from military planners. This illustrates how civilian leadership sometimes provides strategic vision beyond conventional military thinking. Turning point number 4, Operation COBRA. Strategic decision point. By late July, after weeks of frustrating combat in the Norman hedgerows bocage, where German defenders held terrain advantages, the American forces faced a critical question: how to break the stalemate. Battlefield perspective. The bocage countryside, a dense hedgerows forming natural defensive walls around small fields. It negated American advantages in mobility and firepower. German defenders could anticipate movement patterns and establish deadly kill zones. Technological adaptation. American forces developed specialized equipment like hedgerow cutters mounted on tanks, called rhinos, that could penetrate these barriers. This field innovation demonstrated how adaptation at the tactical level supports strategic breakthrough. Leadership contrast. Operation COBRA represented General Bradley's fundamental shift in approach. Bradley concentrating overwhelming air power on a narrow front to punch through German lines rather than advancing broadly. This contrasted with Montgomery's more methodical approach in the British sector. Strategic execution. On July 25th, after weather delays, over 1,500 heavy bombers, carpet-bombed a narrow section of German defenses near St. Lo. Despite some bombs falling on American positions, the attack created a gap that American armor exploited. Chain of decisions. The successful breakout led directly to the Falaise Pocket, where Allied forces encircled and destroyed much of the German army in Normandy. It is a decisive victory that opened the path to Paris and eventually Germany itself. Ethical analysis. Operation COBRA's massive bombing concentration raised questions about proportionality and military necessity. While tactically successful, the bombing killed hundreds of French civilians and some American troops through friendly fire. The what-if analysis. Had the Operation COBRA failed, the Normandy campaign might have devolved into static warfare reminiscent of World War I, potentially extending the European conflict by many months and costing countless additional lives. Human impact. Beyond strategy, the forgotten victims, Norman civilians. Civilian perspective. The liberation of Normandy came at an enormous cost to French civilians. Allied bombing and artillery killed an estimated 20,000 Norman civilians. More French civilians died during the Normandy campaign than Allied soldiers. Historical context note. The civilian cost of the Normandy campaign remains an underexamined aspect of D-Day history. Recent scholarship has begun to address this imbalance, recognizing that liberation and destruction were inseparable experiences for many French communities. Ethical questions. The destroyed cities of Caen and St. Lo raise questions about military necessity that remain relevant in modern conflicts. Was the massive bombing of Caen militarily necessary when German defenses were primarily positioned around the city rather than within it? Multiple perspectives. For Norman civilians, liberation meant destruction of homes, farms, and entire towns, displacement of over 300,000 people, loss of livestock and agricultural capacity, living with unexploded ordnance for decades. First-person testimony. One day we were hiding in our cellar when an American tank fired at our house, thinking there were Germans inside. We shouted French, French, but they couldn't hear. When we emerged from the ruins, the American soldiers gave our children chocolate, crying because they had nearly killed us. The documentarians, bearing witness, behind the front lines. Among the invasion forces were men like Sergeants Ian Grant and Desmond O'Neill, the camera operators tasked with documenting the landings. Their experience offers a unique perspective on how ordinary men processed extraordinary events. Grant noted, "The men knew they had a good chance of being killed, and that created a strange mood. My camera was welcome. It distracted them from what lay ahead." Unseen story. Robert Capa, the only civilian photographer at Omaha Beach, captured images that became iconic, but most of his photographs were accidentally destroyed during processing in London. This loss represents the fragility of historical documentation, even for momentous events. Human detail. O'Neill wrote of waiting on the landing craft. "We just sat there on board with nothing to do other than eat or smoke. We had 10 men's rations just for me. A mood of bitter disappointment came over us when the landing was delayed." These documentarians faced the moral complexity of recording human suffering while sometimes being unable to help. Their role raises questions about the responsibility of witnesses to history. The enemy experience. The experience of German soldiers, many of whom were conscripts from occupied territories with little loyalty to Nazi ideology. This reminds us that frontline combatants often had complex motivations regardless of which side they fought for. By 1944, the German forces in Normandy represented a cross-section of the Third Reich's diminishing resources. Veterans transferred from the Eastern Front, Hitler Youth teenagers with minimal training, older men from reserve units, Eastern European conscripts with limited German language skills. A captured German officer remarked, "We knew the invasion would come, but we never imagined such overwhelming force. What surprised us most was not your weapons, but your supplies, endless amounts of everything." The treatment of German prisoners varied widely, from humane handling according to Geneva Conventions to occasional battlefield executions. The transformation of communities, behind the front lines. For communities in the path of war, liberation was not a single moment, but a process of destruction, adaptation, and eventual rebuilding. The physical transformation of Normandy was dramatic. 70% of Cannes destroyed. Saint-Lô so thoroughly devastated it was called the capital of ruins. Ports and transportation infrastructure demolished. Agricultural lands rendered unusable by craters and unexploded ordnance. For many Norman families, the Americans and British were simultaneously liberators and destroyers. They ending Nazi occupation while bringing unprecedented destruction to their homes and communities. The destroyed cities of Normandy raise ethical questions about urban warfare that remain relevant in modern conflicts. What is the appropriate balance between military necessity and civilian protection? Strategic lessons, analysis and legacy, the myths versus reality. D-Day's success stemmed less from overwhelming force than from decentralized decision-making that allowed for adaptation when plans inevitably failed. The invasion succeeded despite numerous failures, rather than because everything went according to plan. Historiographical note. Our understanding of D-Day has evolved significantly since the immediate post-war period. Early accounts emphasized heroism and inevitability, while Cold War narratives minimized Soviet contributions. Modern scholarship recognizes the operation's multinational character and precarious nature, while acknowledging the critical importance of logistics and deception alongside combat operations. Strategic truth. The Normandy campaign revealed that complex military operations rarely unfold as planned. Success depends on building sufficient flexibility into planning and developing leaders capable of adaptation at all levels. The leadership lessons. Leadership analysis. The contrast between Montgomery's cautious approach at Cannes and the American breakout under Bradley and Patton reveals how different leadership philosophies produce dramatically different results in similar combat conditions. Strategic insight. Eisenhower's coalition leadership style, emphasizing unity of effort over national interests. Eisenhower created a model for future multinational operations that continues to influence military alliances today. Leadership failures. The divided German command structure, with Rommel controlling coastal defenses while von Rundstedt controlled reserves, demonstrates how organizational dysfunction can undermine even tactically superior positions. The technological impact. The Normandy campaign demonstrated the decisive importance of air superiority, which neutralized German mobility and prevented reinforcement. The tactical flexibility provided by complete control of the skies proved more important than any single weapon system. Innovation analysis. Specialized equipment developed for D-Day, from amphibious tanks to artificial harbors. This illustrates how engineering solutions often determine military outcomes more than traditional combat power. Strategic lesson. The campaign proved that logistical innovation often matters more than combat tactics. The artificial harbors that sustained the beachhead may have been more decisive than any weapon system deployed. The strategic principles. Strategic lessons. Deception can be more powerful than direct action when properly executed. Technological innovation can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Adaptability at all levels of command proves more valuable than rigid planning. Weather and terrain often determine military outcomes more decisively than tactics or weaponry. The human cost of strategic decisions must be weighed alongside military objectives. The devastation of Normandy's cities and the high civilian casualties raise enduring questions about proportionality in warfare. How do we balance military necessity against humanitarian concerns? The lessons of D-Day continue to influence military planning and multinational operations today. Modern coalition warfare in conflicts from the Gulf War to Afghanistan draws directly on organizational principles established during Operation Overlord. Final analysis. D-Day's ultimate success came not from technological superiority or numerical advantage alone. It is but from the human factors of leadership, adaptability, and courage at all levels, from the supreme commander to the individual soldier on the beaches. The operation reminds us that in warfare, as in all human endeavors, the capacity to adapt to changing circumstances often determines the difference between success and failure. Now, let's ask this question to you. 1. Which technological innovation from D-Day do you think was most decisive? 2. If you could have changed one aspect of the D-Day plan, what would it have been? Write your comments below.